Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Telco Talk. I'm Eleni Giokos. Now, the issue of local loop unbundling has been a contentious one in South Africa, even more so after government announced that unbundling would start at the end of November 2011. With the deadline looming, what can the ICT industry expect? Joining me now in studio to give us their views, Angus Hay, Chief Technology Officer at Neotel, and joining us from our bureau in Cape Town is Vitalis Ozianyi, ICT Analyst at Frost & Sullivan. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. Great to have you on the program. We spoke on this at the beginning of 2011 when we said, what can we predict for this year? And we were we debated it quite extensively, Angus, whether it would actually be done. And here we are, a couple of weeks away from the end of November, and nothing has been done as yet. Can it be done by then?
Okay, first things first, I think to be fair to ICASA, who's been driving the process, it's not a question of nothing having been done. Yeah. We certainly have been tracking the work that has been done by ICASA. We've gone through quite an extensive process of hearings. So in defence of the authority, they have gone through the process of running a number of hearings. They certainly issued various papers for discussion. So it's true to say that we're not at a point yet where we have final regulations, but I think we've come a long way along the road. We've certainly had more happen this year than in the preceding. A lot more dialogue,
though, at this point, Angus. There's a lot more decision-making.
Yeah, no, there's certainly been a lot more inputs also from the industry. So I think in that sense, we have made progress. I share your concern that we're not at that point yet.
Absolutely. Okay, Vitalis, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you. What is your sense with regards to the deadline looming? And as Angus says, quite a bit of headway has been made, more than what we saw last year. But the point is that the deadline hasn't actually as yet been shifted, and it is looming. It's a couple of weeks away.
Well, it's interesting to wait and see what ICASA is going to present to the market before the end of November. And as you said, that there's been no indication of postponement of the initial dates. So we're waiting to see whether ICASA will go ahead and release any regulations or finalize, or maybe interim regulations on what options are going to be taken for local loop unbundling. Otherwise, the market should also expect to hear ICASA possibly postponing and saying that they require more time to review what proposals came from the participants in the market.
Exactly, Vitalis, because at this point in time, it's not so much about unbundling the local loop, but more so about the structure that we're going to see going forward, and also the role that Telkom is going to play. You're talking about interim regulatory structures. What kind of structures do you foresee going forward?
Well, looking at what the options that have been tabled forward, the four main options. Option number one being bitstream access. Option number two being line sharing or shared facilities. Option number three, which is full unbundling. And finally, there's sub-loop unbundling. Well, there have been issues raised by Telkom as to the feasibility of any of those options being, say, approved or being deployed in the market currently. And also there have been propositions from other participants, including Neotel, say Internet Solutions, MWeb, on which options should be availed in the market. Of course, the feeling from ISPs and other participants, apart from Telkom, is that all the options should be made available. But then the various challenges that have to be addressed, and just in terms of the kind of regulations that need to be addressed, regulations like access to essential facilities is some of the things that ICASA still has to address before going forward with any of the proposals.
What do you make of those regulatory structures that Vitalis mentioned?
First things first, one has to understand the basis on which ICASA has chosen to regulate. There are a couple of different options for how one can approach the regulation of local loop unbundling. In many countries, particularly in European countries, the approach has been to create specific regulations around the unbundling of the local loop, and those have been quite explicit and tied to the idea that particular players in the market have significant market power or have some control over various parts of the market, and their facilities are unbundled. Yeah. The approach that the South African regulator has taken is quite different. The approach they've taken is that we already have in place what are called facilities leasing regulations. Now, facilities leasing regulations apply to all operators, and they essentially mean that in terms of the Act and the facilities leasing regulations, any operator may request access to the facilities of another operator, and those facilities cannot be unreasonably withheld. So facilities might cover a lot of things. It for example, covers space in buildings. It might cover access to ducts. It might cover access to local loop, etc. And ICASA's view, and this has been backed by the legal analysis that they've done, and we've certainly supported that view as well as Neotel, is that those regulations are sufficient to allow for local loop unbundling to happen. The challenge, of course, that we have, as has happened in many other countries, is that one needs a very strict enforcement of those regulations, and particularly guidelines which show how it should be done. So what ICASA has done is drafted guidelines around how the facilities leasing regulations will allow local loop unbundling to happen.
Are you able to lease facilities at this point in time as Neotel, for example, from Telkom?
In principle.
But you don't do that?
We do in a number of cases. No, certainly we make use of facilities. I think the question that arises, and I think this is at the back of everybody's minds, and certainly amongst all of the players who are looking for local loop, is can we get access to those facilities on a reasonable basis? Will they not be delayed forever? Will they not be refused on some grounds which are unreasonable? So our approach has been to say what we need from the regulator is a set of rules that prevents the withholding of facilities. Maybe just give you a sense of our stance. I mean, certainly I agree with the position that we believe that all of the versions of local loop unbundling that have been put forward should happen. The access to bitstream we regard more as a wholesale service, and so certainly we would expect that to be available in the market as a service which Telkom offers. And then the other access to subloop unbundling or full loop unbundling and so on. Those we believe are very much in the ambit of the facilities leasing regulations, and obviously therefore they should be available. The challenge is, can they be made available with a set of guidelines where the player that's offering the facilities, and in this case would be largely Telkom, can't unreasonably say no. And that's really what we're looking for from the regulator. I think the challenge that we've had, and we've certainly said this in public, is the whole process would work a lot better if we had willing partners. So in other words, if all of the parties to this were willing to participate in the process.
Are you saying that a lot of the parties aren't willing to participate?
Our sense has
what has
been,
your experience been so far?
again, our sense has been that particularly Telkom, that has a lot to lose here, has not been a very willing partner in the process of making these regulations happen. And as a result, what we have is an ongoing potential for legalistic wrangling. I won't say legal necessarily, but more that every little legal point is argued instead of getting down to the nub of the issue, which is there a better way to make available the facilities that exist in the country to all of the people that need them on a competitive basis.
Vitalis, what is your sense? Do you agree with that? You know, if we see Telkom's network unbundled or the local loop unbundled, is there a concern that then Telkom won't really have an incentive to embark on new infrastructure spend or even maintenance spend down the line? So perhaps leasing facilities, as Angus was alluding to, is incentive enough for Telkom, because obviously there needs to be benefit for both parties down the line.
Yeah, there's been that kind of indication that once, for example, if one was to take option number 3 and number 4, that was full loop unbundling and sub loop unbundling, whereby say an ISP gets full control of the copper loop and Telkom won't be able to offer even say the voice service over the infrastructure, then it becomes really challenging. For example, if due to copper theft, if the cable is stolen, then Telkom may not have immediate incentive to replace that particular cable. And also when you look at, say, upcoming developments, both in the business and in the domestic area, one argues that Telkom may not have like adequate incentive to deploy new lines to those areas, because unbundling might prevent or might give other participants access to the new infrastructure and deny Telkom from providing services over that.
He has a point, but we certainly at the recent hearings had submitted evidence to show that there is no real proof that that's what happens. So in other words, in those countries, about 26 countries in the world that have local loop unbundling, and it's many of the Western European countries. There are a number of countries in the Far East. They're countries that have done local loop unbundling. And in those countries, there's no evidence to show that the rollout of local loop has fundamentally slowed down, that somehow investment has been withheld. If you just think about the dynamics, what we're talking about is a massive infrastructure that gets to predominantly to the businesses and homes of South Africa. Not everywhere. We don't have 100% penetration in South Africa in terms of access to physical local loop. But in the areas that we do have that local loop, it really represents an important national asset. And what incumbents always fight is they always fight try to defend that because they want to retain customers. The reality is that what we see from the evidence from other countries is that what happens is that you get more broadband, because by no means all lines today are used for ADSL. And one of the reasons why not all lines are used for ADSL is that there are not competitive enough services in the market. And I don't mean just a different price or a resale at a different price. The thing that local loop unbundling, and particularly full loop unbundling and sub loop unbundling does, is enables a competitor, and that needn't be ourselves, it could be any one of hundreds of competitors in South Africa, to actually deploy new equipment, different equipment that gets higher speeds. We know in South Africa that our broadband, with the exception of some of the fiber services we deliver, is actually behind world standards. And therefore, the ability of competitors to deploy equipment and to roll out equipment on those access lines actually grows the market.
Is that the trend that we've seen on a global level?
That's what happens.
So we can assume that it would happen here.
Absolutely. So if you look at numbers, I mean, there's somewhat less than 1 million DSL lines in South Africa. There are something of the order of 4.5 million copper wires. And the gap between those two is not just the fact that Telkom hasn't rolled out DSL everywhere, it's the fact that there aren't necessarily competitive products that have got everywhere.
With regards to what the unions in South Africa have been saying, they're actually quite opposed to local loop unbundling. And Angus was saying a little earlier that it would be nice to see all parties really wanting to see the same thing happening in the country. Do you think that unions, in a sense, do have a say right now? Do you think that will be heard?
The unions will actually be heard. They won't be ignored completely. But just to validate what Angus has said, because the points Angus has said, most of them are really valid. Looking at what, say, like an environment that has unbundled infrastructure can bring up, especially innovation and bring in new services, not only to the businesses, but also to the consumers. It's important that there's more information given to the public on the benefits that local loop unbundling has had in markets in Western countries. Well, unfortunately, like in the BRIC countries, there isn't a country that has gone through local loop unbundling. But then if you look at, say, developed countries like France, where France Telecom has been able to still remain profitable and competitive despite having unbundled its infrastructure. So it's important that the public gets to hear more of the benefits that will come up, and that will actually be addressed by looking at how to address like the reservations that the unions have. Yeah. Of course, unions are worried about job losses, potential job losses at Telkom. Should Telkom not be able to sustain its revenues that's getting from voice services and, for example, like line rentals for ADSL services.
Vitalis, you mentioned the France Telecom is still profitable despite the fact that they've unbundled the local loop. Are there many such examples?
I could name a number that are still profitable. That's including apart from France Telecom, there's British Telecom, there's even Telstra in Australia. And one thing that you have to look at, like what services are they offering the market? Because currently, if a telco provider gets the majority of its revenue from voice services, surely local loop unbundling is clearly will threaten the business model. But if you look at what services can you offer on top of ADSL, services like video on demand, IPTV, and of course those services will require like very high speed access. So as Angus said, upgrading of DSLAM infrastructure, and not only that, of course, one will need to shorten the distance of the local loop in order to support services like VDSL that we understand Telkom is planning to offer.
Yeah. Right, we're going to a very short break, and when we come back, more on local loop unbundling. Stay tuned.